The three-tiered wedding cake barely crossed the ballroom threshold when the room went silent. White frosting was dissolving in long weeping streaks, sugar flowers tumbling from the tiers, and beneath the vanilla fragrance, something sharp and chemical crept through the air. Sebastian Miller, a single father who had taken this delivery shift to cover his daughter's medication, found every finger in the room pointed at him. The bride burst into tears. The groom's family demanded police. But in the chaos, Sebastian noticed a mark on the bride's cousin's silk handkerchief and understood the cake had never broken by accident. If you think quiet people are always the easiest to push around, watch what Sebastian does to this entire wedding. The Whitmore Grand Hotel stood at the western edge of the city, far enough from downtown that guests had to mean it when they drove out. On a clear Saturday afternoon in late October, the oak trees lining the front drive had turned the color of old copper, and inside the main ballroom, florists were still weaving white peonies into the arch above the altar. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across cream linen tablecloths. A string quartet in the far corner ran through the same waltz for the third time, working out a measure they kept losing. It was the kind of setting that made everything look expensive, and everything looked like it mattered. Catherine Brooks stood at the center of that room, but she was not looking at the flowers. She was reading a text from her mother about the guest seating arrangement that had apparently been moved without her knowledge. Her jaw was tight. She had spent 6 months telling her family that she wanted a small wedding, something intimate, something that felt like the two of them rather than a press announcement. What she had gotten instead was a guest list of 140, a live band, a videographer, and a cake that cost more than her first month's rent. Owen Bradley, her groom, found her by the east window and put a hand on her shoulder. He was the steady kind of man who had never raised his voice in an argument, who believed that most problems looked smaller after a decent night of sleep. He had offered twice to pare the guest list down to people they actually knew. Catherine had said yes both times, and somehow the list had grown anyway. Madison Hayes appeared moments later, moving through the hall like someone who had memorized the layout from a blueprint. She was Catherine's cousin on her mother's side, and she wore her helpfulness like a garment always present, always smooth, always offering the kind of support that somehow left the person feeling slightly worse. She touched Catherine's arm and said the altar flowers looked breathtaking. Then she tilted her head just slightly and said she hoped the bakery the family had chosen was really up to a wedding like this. She said a single small mistake on a day this visible was the kind of thing people still talked about at the 10th anniversary. Catherine smiled politely and said nothing. She had been navigating Madison's particular brand of care for most of her life. Charlotte Banks, the wedding coordinator, was running on black coffee and a spreadsheet that had 47 line items and no room for error. She had managed 61 weddings in 4 years, and she had developed a sensitivity to the ones that were going to go sideways. This one had too many cooks, too many opinions, and a bride running on the edge of her composure. The element Charlotte was most watchful about was the cake, because it was the last critical visual of the night, the moment everyone gathered for. She had called Margaret Ellis at the bakery twice that morning. The cake had left the shop in perfect condition. The delivery driver bringing it out was a man named Sebastian Miller. Somewhere on a 2-lane road west of the city, a white cargo van moved carefully around a long curve, its suspension absorbing the uneven shoulder with practiced patience. Sebastian Miller kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the pavement. In the passenger seat, his daughter Bonnie sat with her backpack on her lap, her ankles crossed, her attention divided between the window and her father's face. She was 7 years old. She was not supposed to be here. The woman who usually watched her on delivery days had canceled 2 hours ago with a sick child of her own, and Sebastian had called 3 people before he stopped calling, and simply buckled Bonnie into the front seat and told her she was coming along for one job, and then they were going home. Sebastian Miller was 32 years old, and he was not a man anyone would point to as someone whose life had gone according to plan. His ex-wife had left when Bonnie was not yet 2. He had simply adjusted and kept moving. He worked the weekday morning shift at a regional food distribution warehouse, stacking and checking inventory. On weekends, he drove delivery routes for Margaret Ellis, who ran a small high-end bakery called Clover and Cream in the north part of the city. The money was not much, but it was reliable and it was honest. Bonnie had been diagnosed with a moderate dust and mold allergy 3 weeks earlier, and the prescription her pediatrician had written was not covered under Sebastian's current insurance tier. The cost was $94 a month. $94 was exactly what this Saturday wedding delivery would pay, and that was why Sebastian had said yes. He had not always been a delivery driver. In his mid-20s, he had worked as a prep cook and then an assistant line cook at the Carlisle Hotel downtown, spending 2 years learning kitchen rhythm, the sequence of tasks that prevented cross-contamination. The way you handled temperature-sensitive product. He had left when Bonnie arrived, and the overnight shifts became impossible, and he had never gone back to kitchen work in any formal way. But the knowledge stayed with him. The smell of vanilla bean paste versus artificial extract, the smell of burnt sugar, and from 2 years of scrubbing down steel and glass surfaces at end of shift, the precise smell of industrial glass cleaner, silver polish solvent, and food-safe sanitizer. He had never once had a reason to think that knowledge would matter outside a kitchen. On the drive, Bonnie asked him why wedding cakes were such a big deal. Sebastian said there were certain things that were not just food. Some things were the physical version of a promise, and people needed something real to put their hands around when they made one. Bonnie considered this and asked if the cake tasted better because it was a promise. Sebastian said he honestly did not know, but that was a pretty good question. He told her that when they arrived at the hotel, she was to stay close to him, keep her hands in her pockets, and not touch anything. Bonnie said she knew. She said she always knew when he needed her to be careful. The hotel came into view around the last curve of the drive. Sebastian pulled around to the delivery entrance and stopped the van. He checked the temperature readout on the cargo unit. 53 degrees. Exactly where it needed to be. The cake had traveled 41 minutes and arrived without a shift in any direction. He exhaled slowly. Bonnie reached over and patted his arm without saying anything. Sebastian did not know, as he stepped down from the van, that someone inside the hotel had been waiting for this delivery with a very different kind of patience. Charlotte Banks met them at the staging area just off the main corridor. She had a clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other, and she greeted Sebastian the way someone greets a service vehicle rather than a person functional, brief, already looking past him to the next task. She told him the display table was ready in the secondary prep room and that she needed setup complete in under 15 minutes. Sebastian nodded and asked that the room be clear of any cleaning chemicals or sanitizing spray, because certain compounds could interact badly with sugar work. Charlotte looked at him as though he had spoken in a foreign language, then said fine, and walked away to answer her phone. Gabriel Turner, the hotel's executive chef, came through the corridor on his way back from the loading area. He paused when he saw Sebastian lowering the cake from the transport box with both hands flat under the base board. He said that most delivery people just grabbed the side handles and hoped for the best. Sebastian said the center of gravity on a 3-tier stack was unpredictable, and catching it from below gave better control if it started to shift. Gabriel nodded with the quiet respect of one professional recognizing competence in another, then moved on. Madison Hayes appeared at the doorway of the prep room with an expression of pleasant curiosity. She said she wanted to get a look at the cake before Catherine saw it, because her cousin was so nervous and it might help to have someone confirm it was beautiful. Charlotte hesitated, then stepped aside. Madison was family of the bride, and turning family members away at weddings produced more problems than it solved. Madison walked slowly around the display table, tilting her head, making sounds of admiration. She was carrying a small pearl-colored clutch, and from it she had taken a silk handkerchief, which she held loosely in one hand. In her other hand, which she kept slightly behind her, Sebastian caught the edge of something small and cylindrical, a travel-sized spray bottle, the kind that might hold perfume or setting spray. He registered it quietly, without reaction. There was no reason yet to think it was anything other than what it appeared to be. Madison looked at the top tier and said aloud that she hoped the decorative work would not shift on the way out to the hall. She said sometimes these things arrived looking perfect and fell apart under the heat of the lights. Her tone was pleasant and conversational, but the sentence landed like a small stone into still water. Sebastian said nothing. Bonnie, standing at the far end of the corridor with her backpack pulled to her front, watched the woman with the handkerchief. A staff member appeared at the doorway and told Charlotte there was a problem with 2 of the reception tables. Gabriel had already returned to the kitchen. Sebastian moved to the side table to retrieve the delivery paperwork. For approximately 4 minutes, the prep room held only Madison, the cake, and the edge of Bonnie's vision from the hallway. Bonnie saw the woman lean forward over the lower tier of the cake. The movement was fast and deliberate, designed to look casual, but completed too quickly to be casual. She straightened almost immediately, pressed her handkerchief lightly against her fingers, and tucked it back into her clutch. Bonnie did not fully understand what she had seen. She was 7, and the world of adult motives was largely opaque to her. But she remembered the motion the way children remember things that do not fit the pattern of what adults usually do. Madison left the prep room 2 minutes before Sebastian finished signing the receipt. As she passed through the doorway, a scent trailed briefly behind her, her perfume, floral and heavy, and underneath it something else. Something with a sharper edge, faintly medicinal, almost chemical. Sebastian raised his chin slightly. The smell passed before he could isolate it. He stood in the empty prep room with the signed paperwork in his hand and a slight tension across his brow that he could not immediately explain. The cake was wheeled into the ballroom at 6:47 in the evening, 2 minutes ahead of schedule. The lighting had been adjusted to a warm amber tone. Candles lit at every table. Guests had been guided back to their seats after the cocktail hour, and when the cake appeared at the ballroom entrance, a murmur of appreciation moved through the room like a small wave. Catherine and Owen stood near the front table, holding hands. Catherine looked at the cake, and her expression softened for the first time all day. Then the frosting on the lower left quarter of the second tier began to change. It did not melt the way buttercream melts in warmth. That was a gradual softening, a slow slump. This was something else. The white surface developed a slight sheen, then a visible dissolution, as if the structure of the sugar itself was breaking down from the outside in. A cluster of handmade sugar peonies on that section released their grip on the fondant and slid, leaving faint tracks. To guests nearest the display stand, the change was subtle at first. Then it was not subtle at all. The first person to react was one of the bridesmaids, who stepped back and said something sharp. Then a guest near the front table pointed. Catherine turned, and her face went from relief to disbelief in the time it takes to exhale. The room moved very fast after that. Voices rose. Charlotte appeared from the side of the hall, looked at the cake, and went still with the particular stillness of someone experiencing a professional catastrophe in real time. Catherine's mother, Diana Brooks, asked who was responsible. Owen stepped forward but did not speak. His gaze moved slowly toward the only unfamiliar person in the room. Sebastian was standing near the service door at the side of the hall, where he had been waiting to confirm the delivery was complete before leaving. He had his jacket on and the signed paperwork folded in his inside pocket, and Bonnie was at his side. Madison stepped into the open space near the display stand and spoke clearly and calmly. She said that the delivery driver was the only person who had sole custody of the cake between the bakery and this moment. She said that was simply a fact, worth noting. Her voice was pleasant and helpful. It was the voice of someone stating an obvious truth out of civic duty. The room believed her. Sebastian took one step forward and said that was not accurate, that the cake had been in proper condition when he delivered it. His voice was level. No one paid it much attention, because the room was already oriented around the image of the damaged cake and the narrative that had just been supplied. A man from the groom's family, an uncle, by the look of it, said if someone had tampered with a wedding this way, the police should be called. Catherine pressed her face into her hands. Owen looked at Sebastian and said nothing, which was its own kind of judgment. Bonnie heard the noise and turned and saw her father standing in the middle of strangers, who were all looking at him the way people look at something they have already decided about. She crossed the room and took his hand. Sebastian looked down at her and did something that cost him more than anyone watching would ever know. He smiled at her. Not a performance for the room. A real quiet signal from a father to a daughter that he was all right, and she was all right, and they were going to be all right. Madison walked past Sebastian and said, in a voice just low enough to seem private but not so low it could not be heard, whether a man in his position thought a simple apology was going to be sufficient. Sebastian did not answer. He was already thinking about the smell. Charlotte acted the way frightened professionals act when their reputation is in the room with them. She moved responsibility to the nearest available surface. She produced the delivery receipt and pointed out that Sebastian's signature was at the bottom, which meant that from the moment the cake left the bakery until it was delivered, he was the named party responsible. Margaret Ellis had not yet arrived at the venue. There was no one present to speak for Sebastian except Sebastian, and Sebastian was a man in a worn delivery jacket standing next to a 7-year-old in a ballroom full of people who had already made up their minds. Connor Lewis, the head of hotel security, was called in. He was a deliberate man in his 40s who had learned to listen to the loudest voices first and the quietest ones last. He told Sebastian he was not free to leave until the matter was clarified. A guest near the back of the hall raised a phone and took a photograph. Sebastian saw it. He did not move. Bonnie looked up at him and asked, very quietly, whether he had broken it. The question came out in the smallest possible voice, the voice of a child who already believed the answer was no but needed to hear it said aloud. Sebastian crouched down so they were at the same height. He said, "No." He said, "The most important thing a person can do when they are being accused of something wrong is to tell the truth plainly, and to stay calm, even when it is hard." Bonnie pressed in closer to him, and that small motion was witnessed by more people in the room than Sebastian knew. He looked at the cake and observed the damage pattern with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years in a kitchen where surfaces told you what had gone wrong before anything else did. Transport failure had a signature, structural lean, cracking along the dowel lines, collapse that started from weight. Heat damage looked different, overall softening, uniform slump, no localized discoloration. What Sebastian was looking at was neither of those things. The damage was specific, isolated, and directional, concentrated in one quadrant of the second tier, with a pattern of spread that came from a fixed point and moved outward. The sugar flowers had released not randomly but from the center of that patch. The fondant at the outer edge was beginning to dry into an irregular crust. He asked Charlotte if he could look at the cake more closely. Charlotte said no. Gabriel Turner, who had come back into the hall when the commotion started, said there was nothing further to damage by looking, and stepped aside. Sebastian approached and leaned in without touching. He breathed slowly and carefully through his nose, the way you breathed when trying to separate layered smells in a busy kitchen. Vanilla, buttercream, the floral density of the peonies, and underneath all of it, faint but clearly there to anyone who had been trained to notice it, a precise chemical sharpness. Not soured butter, not fermentation, not heat, something that came from a bottle with a warning label, something that had no business within 6 feet of a food surface. He stood up and looked at the tablecloth at the base of the cake stand. There was a small circular spot near the left front leg, slightly darker than the surrounding linen, with a faint stiffness at the edge where the fiber had begun to react. He looked at it for 3 seconds, and then looked up. He asked Charlotte, who had been standing on the left side of the display stand before the cake was moved to the hall. Madison stepped forward immediately. She asked whether Sebastian was seriously attempting to redirect blame toward the wedding guests. Her voice had the tone of someone who has practiced sounding reasonable while shutting a conversation down. The response was too fast. It arrived before anyone had finished processing the question. Sebastian registered that. He turned to Connor and said he believed the damage had been caused by a chemical agent applied directly to the fondant surface, a solvent or surfactant consistent with glass cleaner or silver polish. He said this was not an opinion. He said it was something he could identify because he had spent 2 years in a commercial kitchen where these compounds were used nightly, and the training to keep them away from food surfaces was mandatory. He said if Connor wanted confirmation, he should ask Gabriel Turner. Gabriel looked at the cake. He breathed in slowly. His expression did not change, but his eyes went still in the specific way of someone who has confirmed a suspicion they did not want to have. Connor said he was listening. Sebastian said he needed access to the camera footage from the hallway and the prep area for the 15 minutes before the cake was moved to the hall. Madison's voice cut through the room with precise authority. She said that in the time Sebastian had been standing here building an alternate narrative, the wedding reception was running behind schedule. She said Catherine had been put through enough, and that the ongoing presence of the delivery driver was making an already painful situation worse. She said this with complete composure. And the composure was the most effective part of it. She went to Catherine, put her arms around her, and said this had gone on long enough, and that Catherine did not have to stand here for another minute of this. Catherine was exhausted and grieving the version of this day she had imagined, and Madison was warm and familiar and sure, and that felt like something solid. The uncle from the groom's side stepped toward Connor and said if the hotel was not prepared to remove the delivery driver from the event space immediately, there would be consequences for the venue's management. Charlotte, hearing the word consequences with her contract attached to it, told Connor it was probably best to move Sebastian to the security office. Connor told Sebastian they were going to step out. Sebastian looked at Bonnie, who was looking back at him with wet eyes and a grip on his sleeve that was trying not to be a grip. He took her hand and they walked out of the ballroom through the side door. The corridor was quiet and cool and long, and Sebastian walked through it with his back straight and Bonnie's hand in his and said to her again, low and even, that they told the truth, and they stayed calm. That was all they had to do. Connor searched Sebastian's jacket pockets, his delivery bag, and his truck. He found the signed delivery receipt, a cracked phone in a rubber case, a small pharmacy bag with Bonnie's allergy medication, and a gas station receipt from that morning. No spray bottles, no chemical containers, nothing beyond a man who had driven to a hotel with a cake and his daughter. Madison had followed as far as the doorway of the security office and suggested from the threshold that Sebastian had presumably had time to dispose of whatever he had used before anyone thought to search him. Her voice was even and reasonable, and she said it without looking directly at Sebastian, which was the tell of someone who had practiced the words in advance. Connor asked Sebastian if he had any evidence that would help clarify what had happened. Sebastian said the evidence was not in his bag. He said it was in the things the actual saboteur had not had time to fully dispose of. He asked Connor to check the small waste bin at the end of the back hallway, the path Madison had walked when she left the prep area. Connor said that was a stretch. Gabriel, who had followed quietly, said nothing Sebastian had observed was speculative, it was sequential. He asked Connor what it would cost to check one trash bin. Owen Bradley appeared in the doorway. He had come quietly, without his family. He looked at Sebastian for a moment, and then said 2 words. "Check it." The trash bin held 3 crumpled cocktail napkins, a twist of florist wire, and a folded paper towel. Connor unfolded the paper towel with 2 fingers and held it up. The smell reached the room without anyone having to lean in. It was the same smell that was on the cake. Gabriel identified it immediately. A surface-active solvent, almost certainly a glass or chrome cleaner. The kind of thing that would dissolve fondant icing in under 2 minutes and leave a pattern exactly like the one visible on the second tier of the wedding cake. Connor pulled the camera system in the security office and set it to the 40-minute window before the cake's presentation. The footage was clear enough. Sebastian appeared at the service entrance, transferred the cake, moved through the corridor, reached the prep room. He spent 7 minutes setting up. He stepped into the hallway to sign the receipt, stood with Bonnie near the water fountain, and did not re-enter the prep room. He was in continuous sight of the hallway camera for the next 12 minutes. Charlotte appeared on camera going out through the side door to take a phone call. Gabriel returned to the kitchen. The next person to appear at the prep room entrance was Madison. The camera angle did not show the interior of the prep room, but it showed the doorway Madison entering, the door closing partially behind her, and her remaining inside for 4 minutes and 20 seconds before exiting quickly, her right hand tucked into her clutch. Connor said that on its own, being in the room was not evidence. Sebastian did not argue. He said he wanted to ask Madison directly whether she would be willing to let her handkerchief be placed in a sealed bag for testing, given that she had been holding it throughout the evening. Madison's composure slipped for one brief, unguarded moment. Then it returned, harder than before. And she said she found it frankly insulting that a delivery employee believed he had the standing to demand anything of a member of the bride's family. The force of her response was disproportionate. The room felt it. Catherine had come in quietly behind Owen. She had dried her face and stood near the door with her hands at her sides. She looked at Madison and said it was just a handkerchief. She said, "Just show it to them and it's done." Madison said Catherine had never really understood how much the family had sacrificed for her. She said it in a low voice. But the room was quiet enough that everyone heard it. The words came out with the weight of something carried a long time, and the weight made clear the sentence did not belong to this moment. It belonged to years of moments. The slip was small and complete, and irreversible. Bonnie tugged Sebastian's sleeve. She whispered that the woman had a small bottle in her bag earlier, that the cap was silver, that she had seen it when the woman reached for her handkerchief in the prep room. Madison's clutch was on the corner of the security desk. She moved toward it faster than she had moved toward anything all evening. Connor stepped between her and the desk. He told her the hotel had the right, in an ongoing security matter on hotel property, to examine personal items at the request of the event host or hotel management. Madison looked at Catherine. Catherine looked back and said nothing. Connor opened the clutch and set the items on the desk one by one. A lipstick, a folded card, a tin of mints, and a small, unlabeled spray bottle barely larger than a perfume sample, its cap silver, its contents a few milliliters of a colorless liquid that carried a faint, sharp, chemical edge that everyone in the room recognized immediately. Madison said it was fabric spray. Sebastian said quietly that before anyone smelled it directly, they should know that certain cleaning solvents could be irritating at close range. Gabriel did not need to be told. He placed a scrap of practice fondant on a clean surface and applied 2 drops of the liquid. Within 90 seconds, the surface had softened, gone shiny, and begun to spread and discolor at the contact point. The pattern was indistinguishable from the damage on the second tier of the wedding cake. Owen turned to face Madison. He asked her why. His voice was not loud. Madison began by saying she had been under enormous pressure. She said she had only wanted to make a small adjustment, and that the chemical reaction had been unintentional. Sebastian said nothing. He waited. The silence was a kind of pressure. Owen said that if she had wanted to fix a decoration, she would have found a staff member. He said the bottle was not labeled, which meant she had brought it with her on purpose, filled with something she knew would damage a sugar surface. Those 2 facts together did not describe an accident. Madison looked at Catherine. Catherine was watching her with the particular expression of someone who has known something for a long time, without allowing themselves to name it, and who has finally given themselves permission. She asked Madison simply, "Why?" And Madison told her. She told her about the house by the lake, their grandmother's house, with the screened porch and the dock and the smell of pine that neither of them could forget from childhood summers. She told her about standing in the lawyer's office 2 years ago and hearing the house had been left entirely to Catherine, and the way she had smiled and hugged her cousin and said, "Congratulations," while the thing inside her that had been accumulating for 30 years went cold and hard. She told her about Catherine's wedding being featured in the local society section, about always being the one standing slightly to the left in every photograph, always holding the glass and never the bouquet, always organizing things for someone else's milestone. She had not planned to use the chemical. She had brought it thinking she might. And then she had stood in the prep room with the cake in front of her and used it. She said she had assumed the delivery driver would be blamed. She had not expected him to know what a chemical smell meant or how to trace it. She had chosen a delivery worker because she believed, in the cold arithmetic of social position, that a man who drove a van for a bakery would not have the credibility to be heard, even if he knew the truth. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about all of it. The room was very quiet. Catherine took 1 step back from Madison. Not dramatically, just a single slow step. The physical version of a decision. Charlotte dealt with the immediate situation with the efficiency of someone who had just survived the worst professional moment of her career. Madison was escorted from the event space by Connor and 2 members of hotel security. She went quietly, which was how she had done almost everything, and it made the whole thing sadder and uglier than it might otherwise have been. Then there was still a wedding. Catherine stood in the hallway off the main ballroom, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The sounds of the reception filtered through the wall behind her, the nervous murmur of 140 guests, the quartet starting up again, uncertainly, the clinking of glassware. Owen was next to her. He did not say anything. He was that kind of man. Margaret Ellis had arrived while the confrontation in the security office was still ongoing, and she had come straight to Sebastian and taken both his hands in hers and said she was sorry, and that she should have been there sooner, and that she had told Charlotte before the wedding that he was one of the most careful people she had ever worked with. He was putting his jacket back on when he looked at the damaged cake on its stand in the ballroom and did what he had always done when a problem was in front of him. He looked at it directly, without drama, and tried to see what was actually there. He crossed to the display stand and walked around it slowly. The damage was confined entirely to the left side of the second tier. The first tier was untouched. The third tier was untouched. The internal structure was intact. If the contaminated surface was carefully excised, and the affected portions not served, the remaining cake was technically edible. It was not presentable in its current form, but the damage was a surface problem, not a structural one. He went to Gabriel, and they talked quietly for 4 minutes. Gabriel confirmed the kitchen had 2 full sheet cakes prepared for the staff dinner service, vanilla, buttercream, simple that had not yet been cut. He also had, in the walk-in, a pastry bag of reserve white buttercream that Margaret had sent as a standard event buffer. Charlotte had fresh table flowers at the decoration station. Sebastian looked at the white ranunculus and the green eucalyptus on the nearest guest table. He went to Catherine. She had not moved from the hallway wall. He stood in front of her and waited until she looked at him. He said he was not a pastry chef. He said the cake that came out of the kitchen in the next 40 minutes was not going to be what she had ordered. but he said that what a person remembered from the best days of their life was not always the most elaborate version of those days. It was usually the moments where someone chose to show up for them when they did not have to. He said this quietly and without any performance, because it was simply true. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Then she straightened up and nodded. The next 40 minutes happened in the kitchen, and they were the best 40 minutes Sebastian had spent in a professional space in years. Gabriel moved with the efficient certainty of someone who had run a line kitchen for 2 decades. Margaret had her icing tools in a soft roll case, and her hands worked with fast, clean precision. Charlotte stopped managing and started helping, which turned out to be significantly more useful. Bonnie stood at the counter's edge and passed things when asked and watched her father work with the total attention of a child witnessing something she would remember. The cake that emerged was small. 2 tiers, cream frosting, ranunculus pressed in at the base, green eucalyptus trailing over the edge. It was not what anyone had planned. It was honest, and it was real, and it had been made under the worst possible circumstances by people who were choosing to be decent when they did not have to be. Catherine and Owen cut it in front of the room, and the applause that followed was not polite applause. The kind that fills a room because silence would be rude. It was real. People were clapping because they had witnessed something that day, and the small cake on the table felt like the truest version of what the whole event had been trying to be from the beginning. The last guests left the Whitmore Grand at just past 11 that night. The catering staff were clearing tables. The florists had taken down the arch. Sebastian found the back hallway and sat on the bench beside the service exit with Bonnie half asleep against his shoulder. He had his jacket folded over her like a blanket. He was still wearing the white shirt with the small buttercream mark on the left cuff that he had not been able to get out. Catherine found him there. She had changed out of her wedding dress, and without it she looked younger than she had all day, and more like herself. Owen was a few steps behind her, hands in his pockets. She said she was sorry. She said she had looked at him and believed what she was told to believe, and that was on her. Owen said he had done the same thing. He said he had seen a man in a delivery jacket standing next to a ruined cake and reached a conclusion without asking a single question. Sebastian listened to all of it. He let it be said. Then he said he understood how it happened. He said, "When a room full of people are pointing in the same direction, the person they are pointing at has almost no voice, regardless of what the truth is." He said that was not anyone's best quality, but it was a real one, and it was worth knowing about yourself. Catherine was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that Bonnie stirred slightly against his shoulder. Then Catherine said she thought that was probably the truest thing that had been said all day. Charlotte came out 10 minutes later and apologized with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed the words on the walkover. Margaret was beside her, and Margaret spoke plainly. She said Sebastian had done $300 worth of crisis management that evening, on top of the delivery rate of $94, and she was paying him the full sum. Sebastian started to refuse, and she cut him off. She said she was not paying him sympathy money. She was paying him for competence, and she expected him to have the self-respect to accept payment for work he had genuinely done. He took the money. Gabriel Turner appeared last. He asked Sebastian, in the direct and unpreambled way of a man who did not believe in burying the actual sentence in pleasantries, whether Sebastian had ever considered working in food logistics management. He said the Whitmore was looking to bring on a reception logistics coordinator, someone who handled intake, storage, transport verification, and vendor communication for events. He said the role paid a salary with benefits. He said Sebastian had demonstrated in 4 hours what some people could not demonstrate in 4 years. The ability to stay methodical when the situation was designed to make methodical thinking impossible. He said he would put Sebastian's name in if Sebastian wanted him to. Sebastian said yes. As for Madison, the hotel and the Brooks family reached an agreement about financial damages before the weekend was out. What Sebastian knew was that Catherine called him 9 days later to say she had not spoken to Madison since the night of the wedding, and that she and Owen were taking some distance from certain family relationships to protect what they were trying to build. She said it quietly and without self-pity, the way people speak when they have made a decision that cost them something real. On the drive home that night, with the city lights blurring past the van windows and Bonnie only half awake in the passenger seat, Bonnie asked her father why he had helped the bride get her cake back after they had been so unkind to him. Sebastian kept his eyes on the road for a moment. Then he said, "Because people who are good should not let people who are not good decide how they live." because the kind of person you are does not belong to the people who are trying to take it away from you. Bonnie considered this with the slow deliberateness she brought to things that mattered. Then she said, "Okay." She closed her eyes and leaned against the window. 3 weeks later, Sebastian started the coordinator position at the Whitmore Grand. The hours were regular, and the work suited both his hands and his mind, and he was good at it from the first week in a way that required no adjustment period. Margaret kept him on for weekend consultations. He kept Bonnie's medication in a small cabinet above the kitchen sink, paid for, running on time. One afternoon, a small envelope arrived in his mailbox. Inside was a photograph, not a formal portrait, but a candid, slightly crooked, lit by the warm amber of the ballroom of Catherine and Owen leaning over a small two-tiered cake with green eucalyptus at its base, cutting it together. Their faces were turned toward each other, and whatever they were saying in that moment had made them both laugh. On the back of the photograph, in a precise and slanted hand, Catherine had written, "Thank you for saving more than a cake." Sebastian set the photograph against the small ceramic vase on the kitchen table, the one Bonnie had painted at the school art fair in 2nd grade. Bonnie came in from the hallway and saw it, and smiled the slow, wide smile she saved for the things she was most proud of. Sebastian did not say anything. He did not need the whole world to know he had been right. He only needed the person across the table from him to know that her father had stood his ground when every voice in a very loud room had been telling him to fall, and that standing his ground had been enough, and that it would always be enough.